Good afternoon, everybody. A very happy Friday, and it's the day for the podcast on accessibility. And I have the honor of having the ex-head of ICANN, Nitin Wali sir, as the podcast guest for today. He comes with extensive experience both in the internet space, having served at the helm of companies like GoDaddy, Nitusa, amongst others. It's such a pleasure having a seasoned veteran of the internet space as my guest today, and we were speaking on the subject of accessibility and how ICANN sees and how the space of accessibility has been bettered, and how he sees or previews the future for accessibility both in India and worldwide. Proud moment to have you as my guest, sir. Thank you so much for consenting.
Thank you so much, Arjun. It's truly a pleasure being here, and thank you wholeheartedly for actually inviting me to the NABET platform. I do look forward to a wonderful conversation about the internet, accessibility, and everything that's in between. So, just a little bit about myself, I guess. As you can see, my gray hair, right? I have seen quite a few summers, but just to give your listeners a little bit of background, a brief background about myself, I have been in the tech space, in the internet industry space, close to about 25 odd years now. I've
Right,
done
sir.
roles, business development, product management, public policy, and obviously some of the organizations like you mentioned. So IBM, VeriSign, GoDaddy, and of course the last one was that handling multiple roles and regions. So I think by virtue of this recent experience, I've had the fortune of being having the ringside view of the internet growth and technology industry growth, not only in India but actually globally as well, right? So right from the days when technology was all only about hardware, then it went on to software and application and services, and now obviously the cloud and SaaS models, right? So yeah, that's a little bit about me. But yeah, if you want me to talk a little bit more about ICANN to start off with, like I'll be more than happy to do that as well. So
So my interjection there, I think you've been very humble in introduction. You have done a lot in the space of accessibility also and in the space of internet. Just for the audience, the humility don't underscore the contribution. There's been a lot that Nitin sir has done in this space. And yes, sir, if possible, if you could speak about the work of ICANN and how specifically in the space of accessibility it has been working over the years. And yeah, that would be the beginning part.
sure. So thank you so much. I mean, thank you for those kind words once again, Arjun. And I'm not sure I really deserve them, but yeah, I'll take it in my stride. It's a good feeling on a Friday. So thank you so much. But yeah, essentially talking about my last role at ICANN, right? I mean, ICANN essentially is a not-for-profit, multi-stakeholder organization. I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners would actually know this, but it essentially runs, amongst other things, the most critical element is it runs the DNS or the domain name system for the global internet. And as part of this role, ICANN has accessibility certainly front and center of whatever it really does, right?
Right.
So, and I was talking about earlier as well, right? But if I just step back and look at the evolution of the internet from a few fortunate users in the early 90s, right, when the internet itself was just kind of evolving, to today when close to 60% or about 5 billion of users have access to the internet. I think we certainly have come a long way in terms of
Absolutely.
democratizing access, at least internet access, right? But the flip side is always half empty, half full kind of scenario. But the flip side also is, I think, to that degree, ponder worthy, right? And which is that 40% of the world still does not have access, right?
Right.
And if we further break that down to lack of access for people with disabilities, right? Be it physical or just not being able to access the internet because it's in the English script or the ASCII script, or even not being represented online and being part of some marginalized communities.
Right.
I think we certainly need to get our full boots in action even today, right? But yeah,
Hmm.
certainly discuss some of the reasons for this inequity and ways to close the gap further down in the podcast.
So going on to the next question, and something which is truly very close to my heart, given the work that I've been involved in. Accessibility is, I think, not a good to have; it's a necessity, given the huge audience of persons with disabilities who are in a way excluded if we don't have the internet space accessible. Uh, some best practices and strategies for conducting accessibility on platforms and on websites. With your experience, if you could throw some light to that, uh, given the vast experience of yours.
Sure. So I think again. today's era, right, where the digital landscape is essentially playing a very very central role in whatever we do in our lives itself, right? And online services need to be accessible to everyone, and
Right.
that's paramount, right? I mean, I don't think anybody needs to even discuss that, right? But accessibility testing certainly is, I think, the cornerstone of making websites and tech platforms certainly more inclusive, right? And beyond just the greater good that people kind of think that, hey, accessibility is something good, or you need to do it because it's a CSR activity or something like that.
Mm.
I don't think it's that, right? Beyond just the basic greater good that certainly it is, I think accessibility testing is also essential for multiple reasons, right? So if you look at even legal compliance, a lot of countries today have laws mandating web accessibility, making testing even a legal requirement for businesses and organizations. In fact, in India itself, there are guidelines, certainly for government websites. I don't think there are guidelines for commercial websites, but for government websites, there is a accessibility piece, which is called GIGW. It's a clause. Then, if you talk about inclusivity, right? I mean, in terms of accessibility, this ensures that people with disabilities essentially can use these websites and tech platforms. And again, as a
Right.
business, if I'm a business, that's great for me as well, right? Because it's broadening my
Absolutely.
user base, right? Third, I think, is in terms of user experience itself, right? If you have people with disabilities or accessibility issues using your website or your services, I think if they are using it, the user experience itself can be enhanced, right? And
Right.
that is not only for people with disabilities; that's people for everybody around as well. And the fourth piece I think I would like to call out is in terms of something that everybody who goes online thinks through is about SEO, right? So with
Correct.
accessibility and accessible websites, the whole piece of SEO itself also gets better. So the performance ranking and rating also even gets better, right? So
Mm.
that's those four critical components that I think make sense. But I think from a best practices perspective, obviously, and I'm sure you're aware of it, and most of your listeners would be aware of it. But there are lots of automated testing tools that are available, right,
Correct.
where you can identify common accessibility issues. uh, these tools can highlight problems like missing text or missing images or usage of headlines and headings and etc. But beyond that, you could also take the next step in terms of good old manual testing, right? Which I think is
Correct.
extremely critical. Yes, there is AI, there is super AI, there's Gen AI, whatever else, right? But I think the manual testing is extremely critical. Again, in terms of evaluating the user experience itself, right, and making it comprehensive.
Mm.
You could use screen readers, you could do keyboards, you can do a lot of other pieces to kind of build that and simulate that whole experience for people with disabilities. And even in terms of guidelines, like I talked about earlier as well, right? I mean, there are guidelines across the board, even for accessibility, right?
Correct.
So
Correct.
those can be used. And I think some other thoughts that come to mind as in terms of best practices, I would feel is, when you're actually doing your accessibility, your disability testing, you could have people who are actually disabled and could be part of the
Mm.
process of accessibility testing. Right? I think that's a very, very critical component. And the piece I would like to kind of iterate here is that this testing and accessibility testing should not be like a one-time activity on
Absolutely.
maybe just one platform, right? It needs to be a continuous process across multiple platforms. So I think those things kind of help, and obviously the larger objectives of even creating a culture within organizations in terms
Mm.
of understanding what accessibility is. And one thing that I was thinking through, we had this, when we set up this meeting, was even in terms of something, what we use in the cyber security, the privacy space. There's a term called privacy by design. That's what
Right.
architects need to use. I think it's about time that we use something called
Ah, yeah.
accessibility by design as a collective process, and maybe that's one way of taking things forward.
Absolutely, sir. And while at scale, and it was something which was brought up in the previous podcast too, that tools are good, and with the invent of AI and ML, of course, in terms of scale, the cost for accessibility and eventually the economics around it and its scalability would of course uh, grow for the better. But that
Yeah.
said, nobody can replace the cost of an actual participant or a native tester who's a person with disability himself testing for accessibility and application, because tools are susceptible to not check for boundary conditions or not be as conclusive as compared to human actually testing. So I think that's where you rightly pointed out that eventually if a software and application or a website or whatnot is tested by an actual native person who's himself a person with low vision, the premise, the comprehensiveness would be amplified if a person himself with disability is testing for accessibility for an application. And I think that's really important. And I'm not coming from a point of more economic opportunities in terms of employment, but also
Yeah.
on the comprehensiveness of the solution. So I have also, read about, and I remember in the previous call you were mentioning around how ICANN has been collaborating with the government in order to make not only accessible websites, but also in certain other initiatives, which would increase the reach of the internet
Yeah.
across regions. Um, and especially as you had rightly mentioned, there's this huge audience who, in spite of the huge numbers we have, who have access to it and are privileged, there is this other lot who themselves don't have access to internet. Uh, can you speak about those initiatives, sir?
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think while there have been obviously several initiatives with the government of India and lots of organizations. I think the one that's very close to my heart has been what you really talked about was essentially adoption of the multilingual internet,
Okay,
and something that we call in our parlance universal acceptance. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well.
right,
But again to your point, yes, you and I are actually fortunate, I guess, in having been able to have had an education which is, I guess, primarily in English, and that
right,
has given us a start in navigating the internet and I guess navigating the world in that sense, right?
true,
But what about the billions for whom English is not the native language, or who cannot even speak English or read the English script, right? I mean, they are
hmm,
effectively disenfranchised from the internet itself, right? And let's not say that, hey, there's so much of regional content available. People can just read that and get on with it, but I think the multi-billion-dollar question is to ask is, how do I even navigate to that regional content, even if
true,
if I can't even type something as simple as, say, and I'm just throwing it here, but say nitinwali.com, right? If there's regional content
hmm,
there, but how do I get there and access that content in the first place, right? So to
right,
overcome
right,
this challenge and to make the internet more inclusive, I can introduce something called internationalized domain names or IDNs, which essentially are domain names in your own language. So just
okay,
like you have .com, you have the .in, you could actually have a Tamil.Bharat. So it's
okay,
essentially typing Tamil, right? So
hmm,
so essentially
interesting,
that, and again, the other piece around it is also that a lot of people won't know. I think majority of the people who are hearing this probably won't even know. But you have IDNs available all the 22 scheduled languages, Indian languages today. So you could have
okay,
a Tamil domain name, you could actually have a Kashmiri domain name, you could have a Hindi domain name. You know,
okay,
you name it, and you could essentially
interesting,
have it. So I think it's a it's a wonderful idea in terms of at least ensuring the internet is
hmm,
actually even further democratized. So imagine if you're living in a remote village in, say, Tamil Nadu, like I mentioned earlier,
right,
would you be comfortable typing just basic Tamil scripts to get access to the
right,
internet, or would you want to learn English and then get onto the internet, right? So that's a no-brainer. And I think the other piece that I kind of mentioned earlier in terms of the universal acceptance piece is also something that I can took as a step to make the multilingual internet work with stakeholders. Was essentially what universal acceptance is in the very simplest of terms is that all domain names, all email addresses are to be treated equally by all software and applications. It's a
okay,
very, very simple motherhood statement, very honestly. But at the
hmm,
back of it is it's a lot of work that you need to work with a lot of platforms to get things going. Again, going back to my gray hair and eons ago when the internet really started, or even tech platforms really started, everything was obviously coded in English. So there was no space for any other language to understand. Coding language was or English and math in that sense, right? So that all needs to be redone for
hmm,
platforms and applications to understand non-English languages. So I think we are getting there,
okay,
but yeah, things are working that direction. That still is a long way to go, and we need to work harder on this. And just I think just to make sure that things are working the right direction, I can also did the first UA Day earlier this year,
hmm,
celebrated globally, and even in India, it was celebrated very well, and there's participation from the highest levels of the government,
okay.
industry, academia, and civil society. So I think the road is rocky, but we're getting there. Yeah.
Pardon me for my ignorance, but I think this will be a very first if that happens in India, or is it already available? So is there someone say local Spanish domain names or something say in Italian? Is that a solution which is already implemented? For what I know, most domains are just in English, and this would be a very first if that happens in India. Is
It's
that
already
true, sir?
happened, actually. It's already
Okay.
happened.
It's already
So
happened, is it?
it
Wow.
happened several years ago, actually. But yeah,
Oh.
unfortunately, not many people are known. So it's also a chicken and egg scenario as well, right? Uh,
Hmm.
if you have a domain, then you need to make sure everything works at the back end. If it doesn't work, then you
Right.
won't use it. So all of that, all those pieces need to move. But yeah, they're already available. So
They're
short answer
already
to your
available.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
And then it's also would be, in terms of the economics of scale, how many users are there for it? What is the kind of audience pull to it? Do people require a Tamil driven content piece, or is it okay just to have in English? Because when you say about the changes that are required at the back end, of course, scalability would be one of the asks for it. If you're making those changes, is there an audience for it, or is there? I do understand, of course, given the linguistic diversity of the country and the huge audience which is non-English speaking, there's of course an untapped demand there. But I'm more curious to understand more about this. What is your thoughts? Is there a scalability? Is there a untapped demand which you see for dialect driven or Indian dialect driven domains?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess at least in this case, the slow and steady wins the race in that sense, right?
Hmm.
But there are several use cases in terms of people already using it. So, for example, the government of Rajasthan, has actually deployed large-scale
Yeah.
email services to its citizens. So, I think 2 million odd users are using it. Now, globally, there are a lot of users who are actually using it. So
Mm.
that's certainly one step, and the government, to be very honest, has been a great votary of this in
Okay.
terms of helping push this forward. So I think that's all those pieces are coming together. But yes, to the larger extent, industry certainly needs to pitch in as well, right? Unless industry really kind of makes it their mandate to get this going and front and center of people, things will certainly be slower. But yeah, there is a fairly large, not even a very latent. I think it's a dominant demand now. Like I
Okay.
said, we are digital now in all spheres of our life, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And government services are all online. So if you have something like this, which is easily accessible, it helps all stakeholders in that process, right? So I think there's a huge piece there.
Hopefully so, and it will be a proud moment. If I can speak in my language, why can't I interact with the internet in my sure choice of language? Why should I be forced English? Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's how it should be.
Yeah.
Which leads me to the next part in terms of promoting accessibility in your interaction with the government, sir. Uh, how much of it has been, forced in, or how much of it has been, uh, been pushed by the government themselves for accessibility? How has been your interaction in that space? How proponent are they towards this idea?
Sure. So at least specifically around the internet access piece, like I talked about earlier as well, I think the government has done a remarkable job.
Okay.
One, obviously, on spreading the word to a lot of degree. The second is actually on the regulatory piece as well. So they've done a
Okay.
lot of work on the policy frameworks and the regulatory piece, and
Hmm.
ensuring that the multilingual really internet really becomes a reality, right? And I think the wonderful piece, if I just go back down the basics about the internet, essentially is that it is essentially by default an open network, right? For allowing
Right.
collaboration and innovations to be built on top of that. And yes, we hear about things like the splinternet or the dark web and things, which kind of take us away from what the real internet is all about. But by and large,
Hmm.
I think the internet really welcomes innovation, like I said. And in terms of accessibility, I think we certainly are on the right track, right?
Awesome.
Talking about India specifically, I think we have taken the lead in terms of all the public digital infrastructure and platforms that
Hmm.
we have kind of built. Right, our tech is essentially being used not only in India now, but it's used
Yeah.
in other countries as well for public good. Right, and while I'm not in the government, I have been fortunate enough to work closely with several officials in multiple ministries, and I think I
Okay.
can comfortably say that the government of India is extremely open and keen
Okay.
on forging collaborations. So, of course, I mean the wheels of government kind of tend to move a little bit slow,
Yeah.
as you might think. But I think we also need to step into the government's shoes and kind of think through there also, because the government also needs to, and it could be any government. I'm not specifically talking about only
Hmm.
the Indian government.
Hmm.
It could be any government, right? And they all need to balance multiple views, multiple stakeholder views, and impact of any new policy or regulation. So I think those are generic pieces that any government interface kind of organization you would face. But by and
Hmm.
large, I think our government has done a stupendous job.
I also blame it on the childhood tales. No, we've been taught that the tortoise won the race. So unfortunately, that's how it is. Right.
Yeah.
That's in the lighter vein. But yeah. So the next part, one case study, which on which you've collaborated with the government, which you find worthy of speaking about to the larger audience, and where that was the highlights of your career, so to say. I understand there would be money, but something which is closest to your heart, or something which you have been most actively involved with. If you bring one of those to the forefront.
Sure. I mean, so again, I think if you just want to talk about the last the ICANN engagement, uh, obviously the one I talked about essentially was the Rajasthan email piece, right? Seeing that local language rollout of Hindi emails across to all citizens of Rajasthan being used by 2 million odd users, actually meeting people who are using it. Rajasthan police uses it very, very effectively. The kind of stuff that has happened there, that's real living proof that something has really moved in the right direction. So I think that's certainly one which is I'm very, very happy about. uh,
Hmm.
but on the larger scale, I think all of us probably would be happy in terms of work that the government has done around, say, Aadhaar, right?
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
the Aadhaar started off as a government program and an initiative, but essentially back in it was tech volunteers and folks from actually the industry moving in for a couple of years and actually helping it get off the ground, along with obviously Nandan Nilekani, who's the co-founder of Infosys. I know a lot of my friends, I used to work at Intel. A lot of them actually moved from Intel and
Hmm.
actually were helping out there for several years and working there, pro bono and stuff like that. So I think that kind of engagement has happened. So I think a lot more to come. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, on that piece, something which comes to my mind, I think when the shift happened that let's get the best rather than those from the bureaucracy to
Yeah.
lead initiatives, I think that was a game changer. When you talk about the huge benefits in terms of security, in terms of universal identification, in terms of, mapping of subsidiaries and whether they are or not reaching the end beneficiary, all of that wouldn't have been possible had Aadhaar not been there. And
Absolutely.
I absolutely, endorse the fact that when you have an expert uh, coming from the industry, not necessarily from the bureaucracy, leading initiatives, you have his magic and his charisma, along with the implementation skills, which actually drives initiatives to its success. And of course, like Aadhaar, hopefully we'll have many more initiatives in the future, which would
Absolutely.
drive. And I had my interaction with my peers who were working the same space of accessibility in Bangladesh, and what they told me was that a very similar model has been implemented there too, because in terms of security concerns, in terms of whatever counterterrorism, there is so much which happens if you have identification of every citizenry uh, happening. So and not only on the Aadhaar, but there's so many other initiatives, the NPCI, the payment gateways, the success around that. We are actually leading the charge on many. It's not that we are following up. As you rightly
Yeah.
mentioned, how Europe has been trying to, create a payment gateway solution which is similar to what we have done here.
Yeah.
It's proud to know that we are leading initiatives rather than being the ones who are, customizing it to our own needs. So that's yes, that's something which we can be proud of.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think just to your point, you talked about Bangladesh, right? So obviously, I used to work with a lot of folks in South Asia as well, and obviously with Bangladesh as well. Bangladesh has a really nice vision. They call it Smart Bangladesh 2040. They have
Hmm.
a amazing vision in terms of where they want to take the country in the next 10 to 15 odd years. And obviously, all of these pieces that we're talking about right now in terms of accessibility, cybersecurity, privacy by design, things like that, all of them have been factored in. So I think South Asia, India certainly leading from the front for
Hmm.
the big brother, if you may. But I think
Yeah.
whole of South Asia in that sense is taking the lead in terms of digital and in terms of accessibility across. So yeah.
So, on the long-term programs of ICANN and how you see that shaping for the good, accessibility specifically, and broadly on other aspects of the internet. Uh, when you were at the helm, some programs which are futuristic and which you would want to highlight around, which can help improve accessibility, specifically in general, the quality of experience, internet experience. Some programs which come to your mind which you would want to speak about, which are futuristic.
So I mean, depending on how you really define futuristic, to be really honest,
Yeah,
but yeah,
the timelines
like
for it.
I said, at least in terms of public policy and working through, regulatory bodies and civil society and academia and all of that, right? It's unfortunately or fortunately, whichever you look at it, I guess, is you know it is the tortoise and the turtle, the tortoise and the hare race in that sense, right? Because like I alluded to earlier, you need to take a lot of pieces in your stride in terms of stakeholder engagement and stuff like that, right? So it does take time. So that's a little disclaimer that I really wanted to kind of point out to your participants. But I think again, back to square one in terms of talking about the internet. Like I said, so I think internet itself, does continue to shape our world, right? It's in its own way, at least. Like I said earlier, from a few thousand users to a few billion users now, it is
Mm.
ensuring inclusion in that sense, right? And accessibility for that matter, right? And even ICANN, in that sense, has actually recognized that need to promote accessibility and digital inclusion, not only in India but obviously globally, right? And some of the key pillars that ICANN really works through in terms of making sure that this becomes a reality. And obviously, these are uh, multi-year things that happen. It doesn't happen overnight in that sense. But yeah, the first
True.
pillar probably I can talk about is universal acceptance, which you really talked about earlier. The second one aligned with that is multilingualism. So specifically, we really look like a country like India. Language diversity itself is such a major challenge, right? So ICANN tries to promote the use of local scripts and languages online. Third, and very, very critical, I think, is something which is very important for us is capacity building programs, engagement, collaboration. How do you invest in these large scale, uh, multi-year capacity building programs, engagements, and provide all stakeholders, with necessary skills to participate effectively in global conversations around internet governance, accessibility, and all the other pieces, right? I mean, most of the times what happens is that, if something comes out, some stakeholder would say, hey, but I don't even know what's happening. How did this come about? But I think there
Right.
is as much an onus on us as stakeholders to be part of those conversations
Right.
and give our views. It may or may not be accepted, but at least we need to be sitting at the table and giving our views, right? And I think just in terms of some insights from, again, what we worked on in terms of, ICANN itself as well, right? I think the critical elements have been around these capacity building, collaboration, and policy advocacy works that need to happen to make sure that everything is fairly inclusive in terms of policy that comes out that promotes digital accessibility and addresses some of the barriers to entry and some of the inequity that's still available online. So, yeah.
So, coming back to the big brother of this region that India is, and something which is very close to my heart is I think the learnings of ICANN and the initiatives which we are leading, it also becomes important to transmit that information or have its visibility to whatever extent possible among other South Asian countries. So, in terms of, let's say, those who are still catching up on the digital game, let's say Vietnam or let's say Sri Lanka or other countries, does ICANN India or ICANN in general collaborate with entities in these countries, and are we also working towards improvement of the lives, which I think we owe responsibility to for improvement of the lives of the differently abled, or otherwise improving the space of accessibility, or generally the internet, making it improved version of it for stakeholders or for the beneficiaries in these smaller South Asian countries. Are we working to that direction too?
Sure. So ICANN, like I said, it's basically a not-for-profit, right? So
Right.
it's that if it looks at larger quote unquote profit in say, so the US will only work in the US region, or if it sees something better in Europe, will only work in the Europe region, right?
Hmm.
ICANN by default actually works for everybody. In fact, the tagline of ICANN itself is one world, one internet, right?
Okay.
That's the mission line that they go with in that sense, right? So yeah, so to your point in terms of maybe Big Brother essentially was a wrong statement to use, but having said that, yeah, we are certainly better placed digitally, if you may, in that sense, in the South Asian region, in that sense. But there's a lot of collaboration which is happening, not only from an ICANN perspective, but I think even from a government to government perspective.
Right.
There's a lot of collaboration which is happening, which is certainly helping everybody in the space. But if I just flip it back to over to ICANN again, ICANN certainly has a lot of these government advisory committees, right? It's called the GAC, where folks from every government can actually be at the table and put in
Okay.
their concerns, their feedback around policies about things that are happening from a government perspective. And it's an open platform again, right? So that allows for a very nice and healthy conversation around practices or around digital pieces which will ultimately affect me as a citizen of that country. So
Okay.
that's one of the things that certainly is tried. And ICANN does these meetings every couple of months, so that
Okay.
happens. So people get together and talk about things. But beyond that, obviously beyond the CAC as well, there's several other things that ICANN does to help promote internet governance and conversations around internet governance and global best practices. So all of that certainly happens. So,
I also, made the statement because even NABIT is, working on a similar initiative, not exactly on the space of internet accessibility, but the best practices of employment that we have been able to implement in the last 13 years of our existence. Um, it's close to my heart that we need to create reflections or customized solutions um, in smaller South Asian countries by giving the access to resources and learnings which we have gathered with the larger audience or disability advocates in those regions so that they can create customized solutions for their own countries and for their own beneficiaries. Effectively, it at a holistic level works towards improvement of life of all. And yeah, I think that tag comes with a lot of responsibility of a big brother tag because a brother is someone who would also participate to ensure that it's just not he or himself who's prospering or sustaining or creating better solutions for. And I think, of course, given the size, given the economic might, we owe that as a responsibility to other countries. And in what the smallest way possible, I think NABIT is working towards it. Success or not, of course, it's God's decision, but whatever little effort that we can push to that. So that was the reason why I asked this.
no, absolutely. I think you just echoed what I said earlier, right? Because saying it's been a 13-year journey and you're still working through it, right? And that's what it really takes, right?
Absolutely.
It is a long race, right? And you encounter a lot of things in between from here to success, right? So yeah, absolutely. More power to you guys. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Um, that's about it. So thank you so much for this informative session. I think me and my audience had a great learning experience, and uh, it's an honor to have you as my guest again. And look forward for more interactions offline, and also if it could be possible to speak more on the internet and its accessibility. That and there's so much immense experience there that I'm very selfishly want to delve in as much as possible.
Sure.
So, with that and with a lot of gratitude, I thank you for your presence today, sir. And the last parting words, if you may.
Oh, thank you so much, Arjun. It was wonderful talking to you. I think you bring so much of wealth of information yourself on the table. So it's wonderful speaking to you, and look forward to much more interactions with you and your team. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure speaking, sir. Thank you. Take care.
Bye bye.